Antiochus chose to stop the attack and withdraw. So that's where the expression to draw a line in the sand comes from. They were on a sandy place, I guess. And anyway, I mean, it's just one of those things that happens, I guess, to be the story that passed down in history, to draw a line in the sand. Cross it and you got troubles. So we still use it today, although probably none of us have ever drawn a line in the sand or crossed it.
President Bush did during Desert Storm.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it's used, what's the word, as a figuratively,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But literally, I don't know that it ever happens. But supposedly it happened then, so. All right. With that introduction to Antiochus, that's one of the good stories about him. And we won't
Probably
deal with
the
too
only
many of
one.
the bad ones, actually. But
Yeah.
he doesn't have a good reputation. So let's pray. Father, just thank you for the opportunity to gather again as we have, and just bless us as we study this together, and help our minds to be open, not only just to hear the history and the interesting things about it, but to consider maybe how we ought to behave, how we ought to respond, so that we follow you and not follow the ways of the world. So with that in mind, we begin with Daniel's vision in chapter 8, which I titled A Ram, a Goat, and Several Horns. That's kind of intriguing, but maybe not, I don't know. All right, we've already talked about in the last couple of weeks the first 6 chapters of Daniel. Shawn has certainly
7.
talked.
First 7.
Well, the first 6, really. The first 6 chapters are kind of history.
Yeah.
And then the last 6 chapters are more visions and prophecies. And Shawn began that subject last week with chapter 7. But there's another distinction that happens. I'm sorry, got lost here. Anyway, another separation that takes place beginning with 7, okay? Because the first, from chapter 2 through chapter 7, is written in Aramaic, which is kind of the common language of that era, like English is for us in our world today. Anybody who had to deal with other nations, I guess, would have had to know some Aramaic. Just as today in the world, no matter where you live, if you can speak English, you can probably find somebody who can speak English. That's not to our glory. That's just the way it happens. And it does make it easier to travel abroad. You can almost always find somebody who knows somebody who can translate English. If you don't know English, you might be lost in a strange place. Anyway, so that's Aramaic. But beginning in chapter 8, the language switches to Hebrew. And for the rest of the book, it's all in Hebrew. And there's no really good explanation for that. I did record here that to some senses, chapters 2 through 7 has messages for all kinds of people, where the last 5 chapters of Daniel is more directly concerning God's people, Israel and beyond. But that's not entirely satisfactory to me. I don't know if you have any opinion, Shawn, on that.
It's the only explanation.
It's
I've
about the
heard.
only one I've heard, yeah, and I don't know. And nobody seems to be real satisfied with it. Anyway. All right, so we begin, though, with the opening words of the 8th chapter. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. Another little note here, things are not chronological in Daniel. We jump around a bit. And apparently this vision in chapter 8 was about 2 years after the one in chapter 7. That's kind of a general, it's a little bit vague, but the idea that in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign would put it about 2 years after the one in chapter 7, okay? But still about 12 years before the story that's told in chapter 5. Remember the handwriting on the wall? That was in the last year of Belshazzar's reign, so that was like 12 years later. So the only reason I put that in, you don't have to keep track of that or know that, but just realize when you read through Daniel, this is not necessarily chronological. It kind of hops around a bit, and it's a collection of different things that happened that Daniel experienced, Daniel saw, so forth. So, okay. All right, we'll look at the vision itself is recorded in in verses 1 through 13, and the kind of the explanation of the vision that Daniel received from the angel Gabriel shows up in verses 14 to 27. And we're not going to go through the vision and then try to go through the explanation. We'll try to do it all together, so it gets a little confusing, but that's the way we're going to do it. We'll try to look at them together. So, in my vision, continues Daniel in verses 2 and 3, I saw myself in the Citadel of Souza. This reminded me of something. Somebody want to read that, and I'm going to post it to us.
How far do you want?
Read the quote, yeah, whatever that is in the lesson. 6 and 7?
2 and 3.
2 and 3, okay.
Do you want to read that?
Sure. I saw myself in the Citadel of Souza in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside the Utai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later.
Okay, so that's the first part of the vision. I've got something I'm going to pass around here. Well, I'll start up here, and I've got about 3 copies of this, so we'll kind of divide it here
Yeah.
somehow. So you can take a look at it. This is just, I'm a map person. Some people are and some people aren't. And you might say, map, I don't want to look at a map. I don't even know how to read it. But there's, I've got 3 things here. One is the first page here shows the ancient Near East in
Terry?
about this time, or a little bit before this. Well, I was expecting you to go that way with it, actually.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. Anyway, and it gives you an idea of what the countries were, and then there's another, anyway, just, you don't worry about trying to figure it all out, but if it, you know, you can go it and maybe go that way then, since we did this. Whatever. Don't worry, don't get too hung up on it, but it gives you an idea of what the area we're talking about. And Daniel was in Souza when he saw this vision, he says. He was in the Citadel of Souza. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit. But yeah, no. Down verse 2 and 3. Yeah, you read that. I saw myself in the Citadel of Souza. And Souza was a kind of a provincial capital of Babylon at that time. And it is marked on the map. There's a circle around it. It's just above the, what is that? I can't think of that.
Pass it down that way to the shard.
That's water, I take it.
What was a citadel?
Oh, some kind of castle, maybe the provincial fortress, something, I don't know.
It's on the same.
It's the Mediterranean.
Souza is right.
No, that's not the Mediterranean.
No?
That's
Where's the
the
Mediterranean?
Persian
Over
Gulf,
here?
part of the Persian Gulf, isn't it?
Look at the second page, I think, too.
Here,
Oh,
yeah.
here's the Mediterranean. this one.
Mediterranean,
Mediterranean's over there.
because here's
Okay.
Turkey now.
Oh, right, okay. And Jerusalem's here.
The very last page of it is kind of a modern, what the modern
Right.
look is. And
That's
that may help
what's
you get
Yeah,
oriented.
see,
a little
that
bit.
is interesting to look at that.
Like I say, I'm a kind of a map person. I always enjoy that. When I was a kid and we
So,
were,
of course, we're talking about Iran and Iraq today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Oh, this is where Souza is. Yeah. Yeah.
when I was a kid and we were out on a trip traveling, I'd have my nose in the map trying to figure out where, and my parents would say, Tim, get you out of there, put the map away, look out the scenery, look out, where are we? So now you're suffering because I'm a map person and you have to I have my idiosyncrasies, so. Anyway, but I do think it's good to know where in the world did this happen? And all of us have a kind of a vague idea, but not so much. And most of us have not spent any amount of time over there, for sure. All right. So anyway, he saw a ram with two horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. And one of the horns was longer than the other and had grown up, but grew up later. Now, if we were, just reading this and didn't know anything else, you'd say, what in the world is this talking about? Well, as it happens, it's quite obvious. And in fact, of course, in verse 20, we're told that this two-horned ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. And they're two separate civilizations. They're slightly different. They're certainly related. But they come together as an alliance. And that's the two-horned ram. And Daniel suggests, the vision suggests that one was longer than the other, but it grew up later. And history reveals certainly that Media was an older kingdom, and Persia was a newer one. It kind of grew up later, but it became the stronger part of that alliance. So that's, it's one of the, not that that matters, we don't really need to know that, but that's, that's what is going on here. The ram itself, in general, was a national emblem of Persia. They had an image of a ram stamped on the coins, and the Persian rulers wore a ram headdress. I'm not exactly sure what that looked like. I haven't really seen a good picture. Maybe nobody has a good picture, but there's something about that. Okay, it's not, as I said, it's not as mysterious as it may seem that there's two horns and one grew up later but was stronger. And as I explained that in that paragraph. The first and older part was Media, which was a little bit further north, and Persia, which is pretty much, if you've got the map around you or if you have a picture, it's pretty much what we would call Iran today. Persia and Iran is pretty close. Modern Iran is pretty close to what Persia was back then, as far as we know. All right, Daniel's vision continues. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No, it doesn't talk about charging to the east. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's, I could speculate, but I'm not going to. But it talks about going to the west and the north and the south. And the Media-Persian Empire did spread out to that direction and tried to take over smaller groups of countries around it. Toward the west, it would have been Babylon, which is the one that Daniel is part of. Syria. Further west was Greece. That's across part of the Mediterranean. One of the maps that you've got there, if you look at it, you can see sort of across where that is. And Asia Minor, which we call Turkey, where Turkey is today. And they also went north to countries that are forgotten as far as most of us remember. Lydia, Armenia, and Scythia. If we know Lydia at all, it's a woman's name, but Lydia was a country back then. And to the south, Arabia, Ethiopia, Egypt, so into Africa. And for a time, Media, Persia dominated that region. Nobody else could stand against them. That's what Daniel's prophecy is, or not Daniel's prophecy, the vision that he received is saying. This two-headed ram charged north, south, and west, and nothing could stand against it.
So what countries were to the east then, that he didn't say?
Far enough east it gets to India. That's a long way east, and we're not going to get there just yet. We'll get there a little later tonight, briefly. Most of this area is to the east, between there and India is Arabic and that kind of countries now. It's, yeah. you've got me, Diane. You're not supposed to ask questions like this. All right, anyway. All right, then in his vision, Daniel saw another animal. A goat with a prominent, I'm on the second page now. A goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. I'm going to stop there and we'll come back to it. This goat is the king of Greece. Yeah, actually, it tells us in verse 21, the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. It came toward the ram, the two-horned ram, and charged at it in great rage. I left out a couple words there, but striking the ram and shattering its two horns, the ram was powerless to stand against it. No one could rescue the ram. Okay, so the first part of the vision said Media Persia is, this two-horned ram is strong in power and conquers everything. But then this shaggy goat comes across the earth without touching the ground, it says literally, and suddenly destroys or pushes this ram out of the way and takes over. Okay, so you got a ram and then you got a goat. Well, Daniel, just as the ram was a symbol of Persia, the goat was a common symbol of the Greek Empire long before Daniel. And don't ask me why, I'm not sure how that came to be, but that is historic fact. And this goat that came from the west and traveled swiftly, I like that phrase, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. And if you know history, and that's another one of my pet things, I like maps and I like history. There's a lot of history here. There is a very, very famous conqueror, you've probably heard of, his name is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was like 20 years old when his father, he inherited the kingdom, his father was assassinated. His father was Philip of Macedonia, and Philip had kind of made the different city-states, back then you got a lot of little small municipalities or small areas that are ruled by little princes. And Philip had united that into Greece. And his son Alexander says, hey, we're going to do that one better. We're going to go further. Alexander the Great inherited the throne when his father was assassinated. He was 20 years old. In the parentheses, a paragraph, I'm just going to read it. You can follow along. 2 years later, he invaded the Persian army with an army of 30,000 men in what is now Turkey. After defeating Persian armies in 2 major battles, he took control of the eastern Mediterranean. And if you look at one of the maps that you got, that's basically that whole area that includes Israel, and from Turkey around through Israel down to Egypt. And he went down to Egypt and he conquered Egypt. Alexander was a great conqueror, and his conquest was so quick it was almost as if he came across the country without touching the ground. I mean, that's an exaggeration, obviously, but if you read the history, if you know the history, it's just like that. He's the big guy. Then he was only 30, whoops, I got ahead of time, until he reached the Ganges River in India. He kept on going east, kept on going and going and going. And he got there, and then they got influenza, and they had some other problems and disease, and his army kind of said, hey, we don't want to go any further. This is enough. And so that was kind of ended his conquest. And he died. 12 years after he'd taken the throne, at the age of 32, he was in Souza. So Souza is a famous place. It's where Daniel thought he was, or felt like he was when he saw the vision, and that's the place where Alexander died.
Can I add something about
Yes, you
Alexander?
can.
There's some interesting legends about Alexander the Great too. And he was educated by Aristotle,
Yes, that's right.
which you may know. And he, he believed he was descended from some of the Greek gods and.
There was a lot of that going around.
Yeah, well, there was, and the thing that I think is kind of interesting is I wonder if, and he made some of these lands that he conquered worship him as God, and I wonder if that is, it was maybe a judgment of God to cut his life short. And one of the other legends about him is that he wept because there were no more lands to conquer. You've probably heard that one.
Well, I actually put that in there.
Oh, did you? I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No, that's okay. No, we're just
I
about
just
doing
thought-
that. No, it's
Oh,
fine.
so interesting.
Well, he is a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
He died at the age of 32, and there's sort of a mystery of what did he die of. Well, some said he, maybe died of a fever. There are other explanations. But there was kind of that myth that he died, he was so upset he died because there were something left for him to conquer.
Yeah.
I can.
But he wasn't murdered.
No.
No.
There's probably some theories that he was poisoned, but I don't know that that's realistic either. He died of a fever, and that's at the age of 32, having conquered most of what, well, from a Western point of view, I guess if you will, was the civilized world. Now, we know, which shows up in biblical literature, but India, China had been around for a long time, both of those to some degree, and ebbed and waned. I mean, there were lots of other countries and areas in the world, but when you think of kind of the roots of where we're from, all of us come out of European, I shouldn't say not all of us, but most of us come out of a primarily European background. And so that's our history, if you will, like it or not. During his 13-year reign, Alexander created one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And that fits in with that last line from the vision. I'm on kind of the bottom, the end of the second paragraph on page 2. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. So these are one of these visions and prophecies that you have to be kind of a dunce or somebody not to see that it certainly fits this very well. Okay, that's at least my opinion. All right. So, but then the story goes on. Okay, so that's Alexander the Great. What happened next? Well, the vision says the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Well, again, history was fulfilled. I mean, this is a vision Daniel had before this all happened. This is like, what is it? We're about 500, 540, something BC, Sean?
Yeah, I'm
I
not
think
sure what
it's-
year it is.
Yeah, it's back in the 500 BCs, and now this is about 300, 200, at least 200 or more years later, that Alexander died without an heir, at least, yeah, without a royal heir anyway, nobody that had power to claim that. So his 4 generals divided up the whole thing that Alexander had conquered into 4 parts. And I put that in a paragraph, and by all means, you do not need to remember all these people. But there were 4 prominent generals that divided up the empire. One was Cassander, who ruled Greece. That's to the west. Lysimachus took Asia Minor, which is like what we call Turkey, so that's the north. Ptolemy is the one you might have heard of. The P is silent, Ptolemy. Ptolemies ruled Egypt for a long time. So he had Egypt, and then Seleucus ruled over Syria and Palestine, which is, of course, the little part of the world that is most of interest to us. But I don't know, when I look at that, I think Seleucus probably said, I got the short end of the deal, because Egypt and some of these other places were more powerful, more desirable. Syria and Palestine was not the greatest. Syria, well, again, I'm getting lost in my history, but Syria and Palestine was an area that tended to get trampled on by everybody going north, south, east, or west, because it was in the way. So that area got trampled on a lot. So, but Seleucus inherited it, so that was his share of it. And we don't really need to worry about Seleucus, because his whole story is not our point. But it is a descendant of his who was the 8th king of Syria, Palestine, who ruled from about 175 to 164 BC. The infamous, boo hiss, Antiochus IV, who is described as Daniel's vision continues. Okay? Verses 9 to 12. Then, does somebody want to read that? Give a rest. You can rest your ears from listening to me. Verses 9.
Out of one of them came another thorn, which started small, but grew in power to the south, and to the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth, and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground.
Okay. And I have to apologize because I got ahead of myself and I forgot the footnote I had on the bottom. So I want to go back to that and talk about that. Okay. One more thing about Alexander the Great, a reason that we should care about him, okay? His death, we don't know exactly why. It is half seriously that he died of a broken heart because nothing else to conquer. In reality, his death was probably caused by debauchery and drunkenness. Like many a conquering hero, he didn't know how to control. He could control the world, but he couldn't control his own self. And there are lots of different stories like that. Anyway, but whether or not we consider him as great, and you could argue this is just a big toughie, he's not a great person, but is he really great? But God used Alexander for his purpose, and this is the point I don't want to miss. This is important, I think. His passion to spread the language and the culture of Greece, helped make a basic form of Greek the language of that world. It's called Koine Greek. And it's not like, you may know the old Greek playwrights, they all wrote classical Greek. Well, this is a somewhat simpler version of Greek. It's called Koine. It's called Common Greek. And that paved the way, well, for a translation of the Old Testament. That's about 250 BC. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew originally, mostly Hebrew, somewhat Aramaic. But there came a time, even when in Israel, when people didn't always fully understand Hebrew, and the Old Testament was translated into Greek, and it's called the Septuagint, because the Septu has to do with 70. There was a myth that 70 scholars did it in a week. No, I don't know. I thought a
Yeah,
week.
it's a midrash. It's a Hebrew midrash.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
70 Hebrew scholars came in under Ptolemy.
Yes.
Who's in that part of the land, by the
Yes,
way,
yes,
so.
yes.
Yeah, that's the legend.
Right. But the translation is real, and it is.
Yes.
And it was into Greek. And so that made the Old Testament, what it did, made the Old Testament intelligible to a much larger part of the world, because not that many people spoke Hebrew. So the Hebrew Old Testament was kind of a sacred book that nobody knew except the Jews. In fact, even probably except for the priests, the educated
Right.
Jews. I mean,
The
ordinary
scribes,
people
yeah.
didn't speak that necessarily anymore. So that was the key. And then, for us even more, it's because of Greek became the language of that whole area, that the New Testament is written in Greek. The New Testament is originally written in Koine Greek, again, a common, relatively simple form of Greek. So Alexander, I mean, from my point of view, God used him. He was God's general. Not that God wanted him to go kill people and take over the world, but I'm going to use him to spread this culture, which will make these things possible. And again, this is 2,000 years ago or more, but we are still kind of benefiting from that. And that's, yeah, anyway, I'm drifting here. Anyway. All right. So prepared the world for the spread of Christianity. Okay, so that's finishing up Alexander. But then we're moving on, I'm sorry, and this is where I messed up here. We're messing up to, or talking about Antiochus IV, who is this horn that started small. He came out of one of the horns. He came out of the horn of Seleucus, the horn that ruled Syria, Palestine. And he grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. And Daniel, again, that's the word that's used in the prophecy, the beautiful land. Well, what's the beautiful land? Well, anybody who thinks about this understands that this is God's land, the land of that God chose for his people and gave to his people through Abraham and I'm sorry, through Moses especially in this. Well, Abraham actually, it goes back that far. So that's the understanding of that, the beautiful land. Anyway, this horn grew, anyway, I'm not going to read, we already read this. I'm not going to go back to it, but he was very strong, very powerful, set himself up against the Lord, set himself up to take over the beautiful land, if you will, and so forth. So I do hope that even though I'm not exactly clear in saying this, but I do hope you catch some of the excitement that I feel when I go through this, because this is a prophecy 200-300 years before it that to me describes quite accurately what happened and how God prepared things. So anyway, we turn the page to page 3. Antiochus IV was not the first in line to succeed to the throne when his father died, but he managed to outdo his rivals. He nearly conquered Egypt. He also waged war against Persia, but he became infamous for his severe persecution of the Jewish nation. So that's why he becomes the bad guy, okay? He gave himself the title Theos Epiphanes, or sometimes it's just called Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means God manifest, or in a more general or simple way, just the illustrious one. So kings do that sometimes. This isn't my name. I'm not just Alexander. I'm Alexander the Great. And if you're not going to call me great, I'll call myself great. But he called himself great, Epiphanes. As I say, it's not surprising that anybody who considered himself to be a manifestation of God would meet strong opposition from such strict monotheists as faithful Jews. And before I continue with the story, I'm going to take you down to another footnote. Please forgive me, but these things I think are interesting and important. So let me read the footnote at the bottom of the page, talking about monotheism and polytheism. In ancient times, each nation or each city-state usually had their own chief god. That's not unusual. But most people tended to be polytheistic. That is to say, they recognize there's lots of gods out there. Maybe my God is stronger than your God, but, you know, there's gods there, here, there's gods there. One of the most essential elements of Jewish faith, of God's people, is this clear statement of belief in one God that is found in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. And I'll show off my Hebrew. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That phrase is often referred to as the Shema. And it's the centerpiece of the daily morning and evening prayer services of faithful at least conservative Jews, or no, they're even more conservative. Orthodox Jews, that's the term I wanted, yeah. And they would do that, they do that. That's part of their morning and evening prayers. Now, as Christians, sometimes we may have grown up with, you've got to say the Lord's Prayer every morning or every evening. Not that that's necessarily shouldn't become a rule or just a thing you do. It's not a bad habit, to be honest with you. But this is something comparable to that. The Shema Yisrael, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. That's how it translates. And it's followed by the command, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And that's Deuteronomy 6:4. And I don't think I'm stretching it if you said, if you were going to identify the basic root belief of a strong and faithful Jew, it would be that kind of statement. I don't know, maybe there's more, but that would be the heart of it. We believe in one God, and He is our God, and we are His people.
Well, I think you're right on that, and it was a challenge for them too, because they're called out of polytheism.
Oh, yes.
And they
Oh, yeah.
struggle
Oh, they struggle.
over the years with exactly that, so, and I do think it's the essence of it. I think it's really good that you bring that out.
In fact, to some degree, it played a role in, sometimes maybe still does, for Jewish people to accept Jesus. Because to have the idea, or well, let's put it this way, to accept the idea of a Trinity. Okay, Jesus is a great guy, but, for most Christians, we see Him as God also, as the Son of God, and as part of a Trinity with the Father and with the Spirit. Now, not all Christians, some Christians might make more of that, some Christians might make less of that, but that's kind of central to being a Christian, that we believe in three persons in one God. I don't know if that catches anybody off guard, but I grew up certainly in a creedal church. Not all disciples of Christ are not a creedal church, so they don't really worry about that so much. But I grew up in a creedal church where this is what we believe. We believe in God the Father, we believe in God the Son, we believe in God the Holy Ghost, and somehow they're three, but they're also one. And I don't need to go any further in that. But that was a problem for Jewish people sometimes, to say, how can you say Jesus is God? There's only one God. And I think they would still struggle with that today, a faithful Jew. Okay, that's the side note. Anyway, it is good to remember that that's kind of at the heart of being a Jew, to say we believe in one God, and we are His people. Okay, anyway, get myself back in track here. Anyway, by calling Himself a manifest, still on the top paragraph, a manifestation of God was only the beginning of Antiochus's provocations. When he came to power in about 175 BC, there were already some conflicts in Israel. There had been enough Greek influence and another outside influence that some of the Jewish people were not so serious about being strict and everything, and they tended towards, they drifted away a bit and so forth and so on. So there was some civil wars going on about are we going to be strict Jews, or are we going to be open to the rest of the world and so forth, that kind of issue. When some of that's happened, Antiochus sided with those who were trying to establish something more of a Greek culture in Israel, because he was a Greek and he believed in Greek culture. So now we get into the book of First Maccabees, and it records some of Antiochus' attempts to remove God from Israel. And this quote is a summary of this in a way. The king, that is Antiochus, sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah to follow foreign customs, to keep offerings out of the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths, to pollute the sanctuary and priests, to build idol temples, and to sacrifice swine's flesh, that they should have their sons uncircumcised, so that they might forget God's law. Now, all those things are kind of touchstones of the Jewish faith to some degree or another, at least at that time, okay? God had kind of made them a separate people. You don't follow foreign customs. You don't do what everybody else around you does. The sanctuary, at this point, this is, of course, we don't have time to go into all the Jewish history, but there is a temple in Jerusalem built by Solomon. Solomon's temple is there. The keeping the Sabbath, the seventh day, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It's another, that's one of the 10 Commandments, and that's a key. Sacrifice. You don't eat pork. You can't imagine sacrificing a pig. You sacrifice lambs. Circumcision was something that definitely set Jewish people apart from the people around them. And it was intended to do so. God had, I'm not going to go into the whole thing here, but God had obviously desired, his intention was to make them a separate people unto themselves, his people. We're not going to go down the road on how that works out and everything, but that was very important. Well, Antiochus kind of threw all that out. He attacked Jerusalem. He took stuff out of the temple and he desecrated it in different ways. One of the first things, or the big things he did, he took away the daily sacrifice from the temple. And I put in parentheses, the beginning and the close of each day was marked by the burnt offering. This offering's primary purpose was to express the covenant relationship that Israel had with God, publicly announcing, Lord God, you are our God, we are your people. And again, this goes with the Shema that I talked. I mean, this whole concept that we are God's special chosen people, and he is our God, and that's it. We don't worship anybody else, and he treats us in a way as somehow special, and we're special. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. Now, I'm not saying they did that rightly, and they kind of missed the boat sometimes, but that was a key to them. And Antiochus is throwing all that out and saying, forget all that. Get with it. Get with the culture. Get with the world. That's all old stuff. The world has changed, and I'm in charge here now. You do what I tell you. So he set up an altar to Zeus in the temple, and he sacrificed a pig on it, which was, that's just like, I don't know what to say. Yeah, he crossed the line, yes. He outlawed circumcision. In other words, at least in theory, I don't know how that was carried out, just literally, but if a faithful Jewish family wanted to circumcise their male child, he, theoretically at least, they might have been punished for that, or put in prison or something worse. And if you have any Jewish friends or know anything, and that who are serious about their Jewish practice, that circumcision this is not just a medical thing, this is a spiritual thing. Let's see, he ordered Jews to sacrifice to pagan gods and to eat pork. Jews don't eat pork. Faithful Jews don't eat pork, because that was not part of what they were told to do. He may have killed as many as 100,000 Jews. He ordered, no wonder that they did not refer to Antiochus as Epiphanes, the illustrious one, but instead as Epimanes, which means the mad one or the crazy one, or it could maybe even mean the furious one, the one who is over the top in anger. So again, we don't need to remember all these details, but I hope you get the message that Antiochus Epiphanes came in and did everything he could to destroy Jewish faith and Jewish culture. So this is not, this is really something.
And I have a question about First Maccabees. Is Maccabees one of the?
It's one of the Maccabees. I've got a footnote on the next
It's in
page
the
we'll get to. Okay, we'll come back to that, talk about that. It's in the Apocrypha, yes, and we'll talk about that a little bit, if we get there. No, we'll get there. Gotta move along. Daniel's vision continues. I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings." Then, well, that's a interpretation there. It will take 2,300. I can't remember what it says, how it says it in the Greek. But anyway, then the sanctuary will be consecrated. This is a strange vision. We don't really know who's talking. Some people think that this is an Old Testament appearance of Jesus. I think more people think it's more likely a conversation between two angels that Daniel hears in this vision. We don't really know. But the question that matters to us is this business of 2,300 mornings and evenings. So what does that mean? Well, you're getting a full load of stuff here. So don't feel bad if you don't follow it all, and there's not going to be a test. 2,300, I'm on the next page here, page 4. 2,300 mornings and evenings could be 2,300 days, or about 6 1/4 years. And that would be about the time from when the persecution under Antiochus began in earnest until the temple was consecrated in about 165, 164 BC. We'll try to stop it. It could mean that. Or it could be understood as 1,150 morning sacrifices and 1,150 evening sacrifices. So instead of 2,300 days, it's only 1,100 days, basically, 1,150. In that case, it could be from the time that it could correspond to another time period there. Another interpretation, I'm going to go through this rather quickly because we're not going to fret too much about exactly what it means, just try to make a little bit of sense out of it. Another interpretation makes the point that numbers and visions are not necessarily exact mathematical calculations, but they're sometimes symbolic. And so maybe this is suggests a divine period of judgment. I'm not going to try to make sense of that. It's just anyway, there's lots of different ways that people have tried to look at it. But jump down to that last paragraph in that section where, in parentheses, if we had the time to look at the other yet to come films, we find even some more things to talk about, and we're not going to get there tonight anyway. But for now, we'll continue with the brief history of the Maccabean revolts against Antiochus. Anyway, we're not I'm going to leave it hanging here. I mean, I know Shawn may have a definite opinion, I don't know, but there's lots of different understandings of how do we take this 2,300 days, and especially we try to apply it to the end times, which it also seems to be speaking of too. So this is not one of these chapters that you say, oh, I understand that. No, it's one of these chapters you say, I think I get something out of it. So hang in there. All right, now we get to the Maccabees here. I'm about in the middle of the page. In 167 BC, a Jewish priest named Mattathias, along with his 5 sons, led a revolt against the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus. Mattathias died 1 year later, but his oldest son, Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, along with his 4 brothers, continued the revolt as its new leader. They quickly won stunning victories against the armies of Antiochus and entered Jerusalem in 164 BC. So this is only about, like I said, about 11, 12 years after Antiochus had desecrated it. The pagan altar that he had erected was removed and the temple was cleansed. And Judas then earned that nickname Maccabeus or Maccabee, which means the hammer. Sounds like a professional wrestler.
Yeah.
Because of his courage, zeal, and ferocity in battle.
Yeah, and you say stunning battles, I mean, these were kind of supernatural. They were
Yes, oh,
greatly
yeah.
outnumbered.
Yeah.
Truly God intervened.
And most of us, including me, are not all that familiar with reading the books of Maccabees because we grew up saying, well, these are not really scripture, and so we don't really have to know, and that's okay. But they are worth studying, and there's a footnote here that you asked, Tracy, so I want to look at that a little bit. First of all, I missed another little footnote down there that's worth mentioning. Footnote 6. According to tradition, when the Maccabees retook Jerusalem's temple, again, that we just talked about, it had only a single day's worth of oil for the temple's menorah. And another thing I was going to print out was a picture of a menorah, but I hope you've all seen that. It's a 7-branched candlestick. One that's straight up, and then there's a branch of 3 on one side and a branch of 3. Probably have all seen it somewhere or another. That's a menorah. And it was a candelabra, not with candles, but with oil. And there was only, according to the tradition at least, there was only a single day worth of oil left for it. But the oil lasted for a total of 8 days until more could be produced. This miracle is commemorated yearly in the Jewish celebration known as Hanukkah, which happens to fall around Christmas time.
Right. And also the Hanukkah is not just the 7, it has 8 days, right?
Okay.
4 on each side, and there's a servant candle,
Okay.
which we prophetically would look at as Jesus,
Okay.
light of the world, and that servant candle lights each of them. So it's just
Okay.
interesting
Okay.
history.
You're a little different, yeah, you know a little bit more about that than I do.
A little bit.
No, probably really a lot bit more than I know about that. But anyway, that is, we all have heard of Hanukkah, and that's what it's celebrating, the oil that didn't run out, lasted for 8 days. Okay, let's see, where am I? All right, then the footnote on the Maccabees. Was not just Judas, it was also applied to his brothers. And all Judah, Judas, he's called both, had no sons. The term was used for the descendants of his brothers. of his brother Simon, who is considered the founding ruler of the Hasmonean dynasty that governed Israel until 37 BC. So the Maccabees actually took over and ruled Israel for a little more than 100 years, until the Romans captured Israel and Palestine. So that by the time of Jesus, then Herod is king, but he's not really a full king. He serves at the pleasure of Rome. And it's a Roman province, but Herod is not really an independent ruler. But for 130 years or so, it was an independent under the Maccabees. I think I'm right on that, right, Sean?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right, anyway, there are, so eventually Maccabees came to be used to refer to the entire family and to the revolt they led and to the whole period of Jewish history, which they dominated. There are also 4 books or writings that bear the name 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. I'm not all that familiar with any of them, but generally speaking, I think the first 2 are considered a little bit more valuable than the 3rd and the 4th, but I'm not sure. I don't remember why that is.
Well, it's interesting because it's the books that were the history of the Jewish people between the Old Testament and the New Testament too. So,
Right.
you know, there was a period of time where God didn't speak and.
Yep.
So it's interesting.
They're written in the 2nd and 1st century BC, and they record some of the history of that period. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are definitely included in the Apocrypha. 3rd and 4th Maccabees are not, they're called by another name somehow, I think. The Apocrypha then, and some, you've all heard of it, I'm sure, it's a group of, I could have brought a copy along, but I forgot to do that. It's a group of 14 pre-New Testament works by Jewish writers that are included in the Septuagint, which I just mentioned, and the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and are also considered Holy Scripture by Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians, but not by Protestant Christians, okay? Protestant Christians, and I don't remember the whole history, but it was, well, I think it was always a bit shaky, even before the Reformation, before the Protestant churches came to be. The Apocrypha was not considered quite on the same level.
Right, I don't know the canonical rules
Yeah, I don't
or
know how
why
that
they
was,
weren't
but
put in,
they were kind of included, but not
Yeah.
really, not quite. And Protestants, you know, including Luther and all those guys in the 15th, 16th century who founded everything that we all came out of, or mostly came out of that kind of roots, did not accept that as scripture. But if you have a Roman Catholic Bible, it'll have the Apocryphal books in there. And 1st and 2nd Maccabees are. But,
Why didn't they accept those ones?
well,
They
this
didn't meet certain standards.
didn't meet certain, they
when
were somehow
canonizing.
considered, these are not really,
And I don't know what those were.
not really inspired, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
You know, these are, and they do come out of a different, slightly different era too. I mean, this is the 2nd and 1st century before Christ. The last book of the canonical Old Testament is Malachi, and that's about 400 to 500 years before Christ, I
That
think.
far? I think it's only a couple hundred years.
It's more than that.
Maybe it's more.
I'm pretty sure it's more. So there was kind of a gap,
Mhm.
anyway.
Right.
That was another reason to say, well, this isn't part of the real prophets. This is something else. So anyway, so if you'd like to take a look at the apocryphal books, you can find them online. I gave you the online thing, so and by all means, if that interests you, go and look at it. But do this in addition to your ordinary Bible study time, not instead of it. And we're going to leave it there.